Alright, so here is my Flutter Expense Tracker app. This is the home page that you're going to see once you actually load up the app. This is the next page that you see, asking you for the title, the amount, what type of activity it's going to be, the date, and it's allowing you to cancel or save the expense that you're making. So for example, let's say you start out with a job interview. You're able to put the amount in, let's say $34.56. You choose the date, let's say it was yesterday, the 27th, and you label it as work. Here are the 4 different options for categories that you have: work, leisure, travel, and food. For this, you choose work. You can save the expense. As you say, it saves your first tracker right here, and you're able to swipe out and actually get rid of that first tracker, and you can be able to create another one. So let's see what the other ones look like. Let's say restaurant. Let's make that $25.99. And let's even change it to 2022. Let's say the 29th of October. Change this to food. And as you can see, it even changes the little icon on the right hand side, and it has the correct date. You can add another for travel. Let's say vacation. Let's make this $189.45. And we'll take this to the 20th. There you go. And the last one that is left is leisure. Let's say off day. 134 for the 6th. There you go. And this is what happens if you don't put in all of the different actual amounts in. Then when you try to go and actually use it, say you put this, you put that, and you don't actually select the date, you try to save, then it gives you this screen of an invalid input. It asks you for a valid title, amount, date, and category. And after you can choose all these, you are able to swipe and actually get rid of all these different trackers. So looking at the actual code, we have the main.dart file where I imported the package of Flutter Material Dart, as well as the expenses.dart, which is the file that I use that actually held all the different pieces together for this app. Looking at the main, we have the material app for the run, as well as the actual expenses file. Now looking at the expenses.dart file, here we actually extend this class to be an actual stateful widget instead of the stateless widget, which allows this to actually be read synchronously with the actual widget being built. Over here, we actually can make it a create state and making it a mutable state for this widget for the different notation for the actual expenses. We have to import all the different packages using all these different files that are going to be needed for the expenses list, the new expense, as well as just expense.dart. Looking down here, we actually have the registered expenses. This is the list that was created. These were the 2 dummy variables that you see when you actually open the app for the first time. It gives you a preset title, amount, date, and category. And if you actually look in here, you have to set a double for the amount. For the title, you have to actually input a string. For the date, you actually use the function dateTime, which is a function that's set into Flutter automatically, and it will set the time based off of what I've set in another file that I'll get to shortly. And for category, you actually use an enum, and that is the type of function that you use to actually make the different 4 categories. Moving down, we actually have the add expense overlay, as well as for the modal bottom sheet. This is for the scrolling, allowing you to actually scroll through for the actual app and make it more dynamic. Here is the add expense, which sets the state, which has a set state, I should say, which is actually the internal state of the object that's being used for the expense. as well as remove expense. This is what allows you to add and take away from the different types of expenses. Right here, we actually have the title screen for the Flutter expense tracker, making it a constant text, as well as the icon for using a constant. Here, right here, we have the chart that's made of type string that's actually right below on the actual app. You're able to see that when you look through the app right here, it's actually right below and says the chart right below Flutter expense tracker. Looking over here, we have the new expense.dart file. Over here, we actually extend this into the actual state called new expense, I should say. Here we have the final for the text editing, as well as for the title controller and the amount controller. This allowed it to actually be an editing text field that I was able to use. Here we have the present date picker, which was used to actually give you a certain amount for the time, the day, and the month. This is using date time. This was the function that Flutter gives you to actually be able to go and use the different dates. Here this is how you set it for a year. We did -1. That's how you're able to choose between 2023 and 2022. You have the month set and the day. Flutter already automatically knows what these mean when you actually add the now dot, giving you the ability to choose between all 12 months and all the days that are in the months. Here we have the actually submitting the expense data. This is what was used to actually set in all the expenses that you chose. Here we actually made it a final. As for the enter amount, if it was nullified, that means if nothing was actually implemented in, or if not enough of the actual categories were actually filled in, then it would return num. It would return null and actually print out an invalid input and ask you to actually input all the different categories that were needed. This is what happens once you actually use the text button and actually press on. Once you actually click on that, you're able to click on the OK button, which confirms all of the inputs that you made. Moving down, we actually have for the expense file, we have the title, the amount, the date, and the category, the 4 different things that you need to input into this. You have the title controller.txt file that should actually get you the string. This is the entered amount, which is a double because you're using decimals for that. Selected date, which uses the date time, and you actually have an exclamation at the end, which confirms the Flutter that you're actually going to implement an actual value here, so it doesn't have to question whether or not you'll actually get a value. Here we have the dispose, being able to allow you to actually swipe out of the old trackers and get rid of them. Going down here, we have the edge insets, being able to actually set up where the titles and where all the images like the calendar were going to be set on the screen so that it actually evens up. And that is what all this was for right here. For the row, we actually have the dollar amount, which actually set in the amount string, as well as the no date selected. This was used using the present date picker, which was a file used using the date time that Flutter was able to give us. This was able to use for calendar month. This was actually to give you the image of the actual calendar on the actual app. Going down, we have the drop-down button, which is actually able to bring down the drop-down button when you're able to choose between travel, leisure, food, and work. This was the function that was used to actually bring out that drop-down menu. This was also used where I had to use the to uppercase because all the words were actually started in lowercase. Being able to add name.to uppercase allowed all the words to actually be set as all upper. Right here below, you actually had the pop for the context for the actual cancel string, as well as the save expense, which was used every time you actually submit all the data that was needed. So once it was actually pressed, you would get the you were able to click on the save expense button. Moving on to the expenses list.dart file, this was where we actually made the list for the expense to actually go for the on remove expense, which was what was required for this expenses list file. Right here, this was actually used for the dismissible function, being able to create a widget that can be dismissed, get rid of. That way you're able to swipe through the widget and actually delete the old tracker that you made in case you wanted to get rid of it. Here in the expenses item.dart file, this was what was used to actually make the symbols that were used for the different categories. Right here we have the edge insets again. This is used with symmetric. That was actually able to line up the image and the word so that the strings actually made was actually symmetrical on the actual app. Here you had the dollar amount, which was not going to actually be expressed because of the symbol. So you have to use the as string to string as fixed, which changes it from a double to, and it converts a number to a double from a string. Here you actually use the category encoding the icon to actually make the expense category, as well as making the size box for the width of 8. Finally, you have the expense.dart file. This was using a new package which was called Intel for .dart. This was where you're actually able to use the date format. This was how the package is used in Flutter. This is what I had to use to actually make all the date time and date formats. For YMD, that was for year, month, day. We used an enum for the categories to actually be able to set in the food, travel, leisure, and work. And I had to use a constant icon to actually create all the 4 different categories. And if you look at each of the icons, actually, you're able to see for lunch dining, this gives you an image of the burger, which is what Flutter uses just to describe food. You have the flight takeoff, which is a plane that Flutter is able to give you, as well as a marker for the movie and a briefcase for work. And right below that, you actually have the required this dot for each of the 4 categories. You had title, which is labeled as a string, the amount for a double, the date, which was for date time, and the category, which was using type category. Going right below that, you actually had the final for each of the different things, what type of input they had to be. For the ID, it was a string, as well for the title. For the amount, like I said, it was a double, it had to be a floating point number. For date, it had to be within using date time. And the category, it had to be for an enum category.